I'm talking today about resting in joy, and it's kind of funny. There's two things happening right now that might make that difficult for me. The first is you guys probably can't see, but there's one pesky fly. One pesky fly who just wants to keep landing in different places. And then there's also, I got here this morning, kids were good. I got Starbucks for them, mainly because I wanted a big coffee. But then I got them hot chocolates, right? And we come here, everything's fine. I think Caleb and Esther are upstairs playing. Gideon's got my phone, and then I hear a whole bunch of commotion, as well as the rest of the worship team. And then they see my kids come running down the stairs, and they're just screaming at each other. It's his fault. It's their fault. I didn't break it. My phone got broken. So talking about resting in joy, it's kind of funny the things that get thrown at you. But I'm excited to look at this, and I want to kick things off by looking at a guy you might not have heard of. His name is Brother Lawrence. Has anyone ever heard of Brother Lawrence? Yeah, so I'm sure that's good to see a couple of you have. There's a great book. It's at the bottom. It's called The Practice of the Presence of God in Modern English. So obviously he was in a Paris monastery. So someone translated this, but it's a great piece of teaching. And it's just like a collection of a letter exchange with him and his friend. But what's really interesting about Brother Lawrence is he ran a kitchen in a monastery. So he was in the army. He was part of the 30 Years' War. He had this God encounter. And then later on, he has this injury that happens to him. And this injury is so severe, it's this injury to sciatic nerve. It makes him a bit lame. It makes him live the rest of his life in extreme pain. But this guy has the most joy you would ever imagine. He somehow found a monastery. He's not qualified, so he can't join to actually speak or anything. He just runs the kitchen. And that's what he does his whole life. And the energy and the way this guy lives, the way that he's constantly communing with God, resting in the joy of God, is so infectious that people come to that monastery to visit him. And he's quoted with saying stuff like this: "It is not necessary to have great things to do. I turn my little omelet in the pan for the love of God." He often talks about finding God in the pots and pans as well. So when I hear of a story like that, someone who has a God encounter, someone who has a severe injury that leaves him in pain his whole life, but yet he's known for how joyous he is, when he works in a kitchen, I mean, could you imagine working in a monastery kitchen? I could imagine they probably don't have the best facilities, right? They're probably not glamorous. He probably, he's having to work hard. He's having to feed and do all this stuff, but yet he's so infectious with this joy in the way that he lives. So my question is, how do we figure out this resting in joy no matter the circumstance or task? Because Brother Lawrence had that. And there's other Christians we know throughout history that have that. They call Brother Lawrence, he's the God of the, pots and pans. He found God in the pots and pans. And I really encourage you, if you've never heard of him, to read some of his stuff. It is quite mind-blowing, and it's really thought-provoking. But how do we do that? Because that's a hard thing to do. Maybe I'm the only one who doesn't rest in joy. I know, this morning the worship team saw Cranky Matt come out and Cranky Dad. So, how do I rest in joy no matter the circumstance? When kids play up, when a phone gets broken, when the job you want doesn't happen, when something goes wrong, how do we find that ability to rest in joy? And I think we can learn something from a story found in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42, about Martha and Mary's busy house. And that's what I call it, because I think this is another busy moment. And just to give you a little bit of background and give you some things to remember, the first thing is Martha and Mary, the one we're looking at today, are the sisters of Lazarus. So later on, we'll read in John's gospel, right, about how Lazarus gets raised from the dead. We all know that story. Everyone's kind of familiar with it. Yeah, so we have that story. So these are the same Martha and Mary. And it's also important to point out that Martha and Mary are close friends to Jesus and his disciples. They're not some strangers. They know who Jesus is. They've been following Jesus. They're friends with Jesus. They both believe in Jesus. This is why they open up their home for him and his followers. And we read this in Luke about this busy house. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat at Jesus' feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself?" I think we can resonate with Martha in this moment. You know, there's a big people over, you're having guests over, and you're left to do it all yourself. So I can see that frustration. It goes on. "Tell her then to help me." And I love Martha's tactic here, right? Like, who knows? Maybe she went to Mary before, but maybe she didn't. Maybe she goes straight to Jesus. Like, look, we both really like this Jesus guy. We both think he's God in skin. I'll get him to tell Mary. And this is what Jesus says in response. "But the Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her.'" And then that's how this story ends. It goes on. If you look in Luke, you kind of have, some teaching before, and then there's traveling, and then there's teaching after this. Like, the story just seems to move on. But I think there's a lot to learn from this story. And I think sometimes we give Martha a bad rep. I've been in churches where people will talk about this, and they just talk about how Martha is unfaithful. So she's lacking faith. So Jesus is not here, I want to make it clear, criticizing Martha for her lack of faith. And if we want evidence of that, just turn to John chapter 11, verse 27. And it makes it clear that that's not the case. Because she's the one who publicly says that Jesus is God in skin. Not only that, when Jesus shows up after Lazarus dies, she's the one who says, "If you were here, it wouldn't have happened." So I think it's pretty clear here that it's not her faith that's getting criticized. She believes in Jesus. She's opening up her home. She's busting her butt for him. She doesn't have a lack of faith in him. And I think another thing to point out is that Jesus is not against cooking. All right, I want to make that clear. Jesus is not against cooking, because I'm sure that's what Martha's doing, right? You got people, you got disciples, they've been traveling, you got to feed them. You're trying to get all that together. Jesus is not against cooking, because if you go to John chapter 21, I think it makes that clear, because what does Jesus do? When he's risen from the grave, we have this story of him on a beach. And Peter and some of the other disciples are fishing. And Jesus is making breakfast for them. So I think that shows me that Jesus isn't against cooking here either. I think what Jesus is doing, he's pointing out that Martha's service is coming from a place of frustration, anxiety, and anger. And I think we all have moments like that when we're doing tasks. And they might be the most noble of tasks you could come up with. But if we're doing it from a place of anxiety or frustration or anger, we're missing the mark. I think that's what Jesus is pointing out here, because we don't know how the rest of the story goes, right? You don't know if there was a point where after Jesus must have got done talking, he said, "All right, let's start cleaning up." Or if Mary got up after some moment in the conversation and Mary and Martha both decided to do what's needed. We don't hear of that. But I think what Jesus is pointing out and what this story is trying to show us is that it's our heart that really matters. Martha in this moment isn't really resting in joy. She's doing great tasks. She's feeding the disciples and Jesus. I don't know about anyone else. That's a pretty noble task to open up your home and feed them. I'm sure she didn't have heaps of money, so like she's probably, spending her money, using her last bit of food, trying to make it as nice and as special as she can. A noble task, but the heart's not in the right place. And that's what Jesus is pointing out. And I think one thing we need to realize with this story is that Martha learned from this moment. I mean, the rest of the gospel makes that clear, right? You can see that with the encounter when Jesus comes after Lazarus dies before he raises him. You can see that Martha kind of picked up this little conversation and rolled with it and expanded her understanding. Started looking at how to rest in joy. I think she kind of got what Jesus was pointing out. And I'm sure they could have had further conversations we don't have access to. It'd be pretty cool to know the follow-up behind it. But we don't. But I think it's clear Martha learned from this moment. So I asked myself, what did she learn? And let's read the story again, just to see if anything pokes out to us. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat at Jesus' feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. Mary has chosen the best part, which will not be taken away from her." So for me, reading that, I think Martha learned the importance of three things. The first is sitting at the foot of the cross. I think it's no coincidence that in this story we hear of Mary sitting at the foot of Jesus. Sitting there to soak in everything Jesus has to give. In a place of humility. In a place of reverence. In a place of holding in to this moment. And I think that's the first thing Martha learned. And I think it's something we can learn. How often do we sit at the foot of the cross with Jesus? Really sit and imagine what he did for us. Have that moment of reverence and reflection when we're sitting quietly out in his gorgeous creation. How often do we do that? And I think this is something Martha learned, and I think we pick that up in verse 39. The other thing I think she learned is to examining your heart. I think verse 40 makes that clear to us, but I think she learned to look at her own heart sometimes. The motive behind what she's doing. Sometimes we can burn ourselves out trying to be super noble Christians, right? Every cause, every do-good thing we can do, we're going to do it. We're going to help in Sunday school because that's what I should do. We're going to help with youth. We're going to help clean the grounds. We're going to help hand out communion. We're going to help with this outreach. And we just tick every box of everything we can help with. And for some people, they have energy and time and capacity to do that, which is awesome. But others don't, and then they get burnt out. They get angry. They get frustrated. They start showing up to do the tasks they need to do. Maybe it's welcoming at church, and they're just not in the right heart. They're frustrated. They'd rather sleep in that little bit and just come and sit in church and just experience. And I think Martha caught on to this, and she started examining her heart before she did things. Started looking at it. Making sure she's still resting in joy. Because there's always more to do. That's one thing I've learned from my role here at the church, and especially as a chaplain in schools. And I don't know if there's any, I'm sure there's some people here who've done some social work type fields, but there's always more to do. People are always coming up to you, "Oh, Chappie, have you thought about this? Oh, Pastor Matt, have you thought about this?" And there's great things to do. And if I stretch myself doing all of them, what do you think is going to end up happening? Burnout. What's the biggest thing that plagues chaplains, youth workers, anyone who works in those kind of fields? It's burnout. And I think the reasons why is we don't examine our hearts enough. I think it's why we have people walk away from the church, because they get burnt out. They come to Christ, put their hands up, and then they're eager and they're filled with zeal and they just want to do everything. And then 5 years down the track, they're just, I quit. I think we can learn something from examining our hearts sometime. And the last thing, in verse 41 to 42, I think it makes it clear to me that she learned the importance of staying grounded. And what I mean by that, I need to clarify, because I was talking to Gabby, who's doing Kids Church. She's the intern here. I said, "What do you think this means?" And she said something that I didn't really mean, so I was like, I need to unpack it. So what I mean by standing grounded is just making sure no matter what task we're doing, we realize we can connect with God in that moment. We realize no matter the mundane task, if it's just washing dishes, God can be there and that can be your God moment. That's how we stay grounded. That's how we don't let the task overwhelm us. We invite God into every task, even brushing our teeth. I mean, what's another time you look at yourself in the mirror for that long? Like, if we're honest, right? In a non-judgmental way, because no one cares before you go to bed. You're brushing your teeth quick. That could be a time we just sit. We stay grounded and invite God into that moment. So that's what I mean by staying grounded. I mean inviting God in to all these tasks that we do. No matter if they're big, preaching on a stage, or if it's tucking my kids in at night. I need to stay grounded and invite God in that same capacity no matter what I'm doing. And I think Martha learned that. So how do we follow the lead of Martha and Brother Lawrence, who I talked to you a little bit about earlier this morning? I think we put into practice what I've just talked about. We put into practice sitting at the foot of the cross, making that our starting point every day. Having time to just sit in that place at the feet of Jesus and just soak in who he is. And then we examine our heart. We look at the heart, how our heart's really going. And who knows what that might mean. That might mean you have to let some things go. That might be really good things. But your heart right now is struggling, so you need to drop it. And who knows what that might be, but we have to examine our heart if we want to rest in this joy that they found. And then we have to stay grounded by inviting God in to every task. I love that every Sunday when we come to church, we always pray before the service. So I get the worship team. Sometimes we get the person leading communion, and we'll pray, right, for God to be present. What if I had that focus in everything that I did? How much more grounded would I be? Maybe then I would discover what Brother Lawrence talked about and be washing dishes and have the most divine encounter with God. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that could be available if we take this in. Because if we practice this, it's going to mean we're becoming intentional with everything that we do. So of course we're going to rest in joy. There's intentionality to everything that we're doing, no matter what it is. Heck, it could be finances. I know we're so blessed here at the church to have an amazing individual who just knows finances. And he can poke around with numbers and do amazing things. And I'm sure he gets lots of joy out of it. You tell me to do that? Like that. And then if the church was like, "Matt, you're in charge of the we're going to be broke pretty quick because I have no idea." So who knows what it is? It can be anything. But if we're doing stuff with intentionality, it can change those moments. And we'll have these God moments we never imagined. And for me, I had one this week. It's funny. I think it was Caleb saw me put the soccer ball on this slide. He goes, "Why do you got a soccer ball?" And I was like, "Oh, you'd have to wait to figure it out." But he didn't stay in here, so now he just won't know. But the reason I put a soccer ball up is I had a moment like this. So it was in the busyness of getting ready for school. My place is a bit small with the 3 kids there. So we're just getting ready for school, doing what we need to do. Somehow, I don't know how, the kids woke up and they didn't fight. I don't know. It was amazing. We had breakfast. I had a bit of a joke, and I was washing dishes, and I was starting to get cranky. I just made breakfast. Can't my 14-year-old wash up? I shouldn't be washing up these stupid dishes. And then I just kind of felt like God just slapped me in the face over it. And I heard my kids outside playing soccer, just giggling and having a laugh. And I just soaked that in and thanked God for it, finished up the dishes, and then went and had the funnest game of soccer where there was no fighting with anyone. And there was no arguments about winning or losing. It was just perfect. And I think God was in that moment. And I could have missed it. I could have missed it if I would have let that frustration, which would have been purely natural, just to go, "Oh, Caleb, can you just stop playing with your brother and sister? Get in here. I need you to do dishes before we go." Or when I'm washing up and the kids go, "Dad, can you come play?" I could have said, "No, I got to get ready for work. I still have this email I need to send her. I got this I need to do." But instead, I decided to rest in joy, and I experienced this amazing moment that really just made that whole day awesome. So this week, I want you to remember to sit at the foot of the cross. Take a moment to sit there with Christ. Well, we discover so much about who Jesus is. We discover His grace, His love, His mercy, His forgiveness. How much pain Jesus endures to forgive us is amazing. So let's sit there at it. Let's soak it in. Let's examine our hearts instead of just being yes people to everything. Examine our hearts and see how we're really going. So the things that we do, we're going to do them well. And they're not from a place of bitterness or frustration. And then let's stay grounded by let's invite God into every moment of our day. Not just church on a Sunday if we got to do worship or preach or if we got to do something really special. No, let's invite Him into every moment, even washing the dishes. And I think if we do all of those things, we'll discover how to rest in joy. We'll discover something that Martha and Brother Lawrence and other Christians have discovered over the years. And I don't know about you, but I'd love to discover that. I'd love to be able to rest in joy no matter the circumstance. But it's a choice. And it's a choice we get to choose, and we have to make sure that we're doing something to get there. It doesn't happen naturally. So I'm just going to close in prayer as the worship team comes up. And as I close, I just really want to encourage you this week to remember these 3 things. To sit at the foot of the cross, examine your heart, and stay grounded. Because we all get a choice. I got a broken phone now, but you know what's funny? The screen might pop off, but the screen still works. So there we go. And who knows, there might be under warranty, because I don't know how they broke it. So I could let that ruin my whole day, scold my kids for it, interrogate them to find out what the real story is, or I can just move on. Make a simple consequence of, hey, since you broke Dad's phone, no one can use Dad's phone now, especially because if you hold it like that, the screen just comes off. So I don't think it's good for a kid to run around with it. So it's a natural consequence, and I move on with my day. And I can see what maybe God wants to do, what God wants to teach me in this moment. And I want to encourage you to try to do that this week. I know I'm going to.